Be at church this morning. This feels like a homecoming to me. I grew up in the Broadway area. Our family was always members, went to Zion Mennonite Church, which Becky and I still do. But when I was a child, many services I was here, many of the families here were the best friends of our family. I spent many, many days with people from this church, and I still see a lot of familiar faces out here. So it's good to be here. I think all of us have many days in our life that I would classify as a red letter date. Those are dates that we've never forgotten. They happen when you're married, sometimes in baptism, quite often when we lose a family member. We never forget them, red letter dates. February 7th, 2015 is red letter date for our family. I've been an avid hiker my entire life. Ever since a very young child, I've hiked many, many, many miles. February 7th was the first hike I had taken with my hiking partner, Grant Stolzfus, after having a knee replaced. Hadn't been able to get out there for about almost 5 months, and I was ready to go. I felt good. We went to Nelson County and parked at the Crabtree Falls parking lot. Some of you have been there, I'm sure. We hiked 4.5 miles to the top of the Priest, which is the highest mountain around there, ate our lunch, turned around, came back the same trail to the car. It was gonna be a 9-mile hike. We were 1 mile from getting back to the car. My last memory of that day was when I stepped on a rock that had glazed ice on it. I was wearing steel cleats to catch the ice. I remember stepping on that rock and hearing the cleats grind on the rock and my foot slide. That's the last memory I had for 3.5 weeks. I fell and rolled about 60 feet down the side of the mountain, hitting my head on rocks, rolling into trees, and finally being stopped against 2 larger rocks after a 60-foot fall. Grant heard me, heard me fall, and turned around and saw me rolling head over heels down the mountain. Apparently I was knocked out as soon as I fell. After making his way down to where I was laying on my face, he rolled me over and saw I was unconscious. My eyes were rolled to the top of my head and blood was running out both my ears. He realized very quickly this was a very serious situation. He was all alone, had no phone service. The very first person to come hiking down that trail, we hadn't seen him all day. We'd been out there all day. We hadn't seen anybody in that area. The very first person was a nurse from over in Charlottesville. She came down in the cold, kneeled in the rocks, held my head like this for 2 hours until emergency people could get there. The very next hiker was an EMT that we had never met, who came down with her and Grant the whole time. Some other hikers came along we never said. They all threw their coats down. It was a cold day to wrap me in so it wouldn't freeze, to keep me warm. No one had phone reception. But very shortly, they were trying to tell what to do. Very shortly, they heard a voice from they think it was on the trail below them. The voice said, "The call has been made." There's no phone service in that area. Those are 5 words that have never left my head. I think of them every day. It's been 6 years and I think about that. The call has been made. This person was never seen or talked to. We have tried since to make calls from that area. I've been back about 4 times and I've never been able to use a phone. 2 rescue teams came from Winter Green Ski Resort. That's for a 45-minute drive. One came to the bottom of the mountain. It's a mile away where we're parked. On the top of the mountain, there's a little Forest Service road, rough road. One went up that way. That's 2 miles from where I was because they didn't know where I was. So the crew came from both directions. They both found us, and they put me in a stretcher, and they were debating which way to go, back up or down. Back up is 2 miles, but it's a flatter trail. Down is steep. They realized this had to happen pretty fast. So they decided to go down. They tied ropes around the stretcher to wrap around the trees to help get down the mountain because they didn't think they could walk, carry it. I was placed in a rescue vehicle at the bottom of the mountain because there was no place for helicopter to land. There's a helicopter land at the top of the field, but they didn't go that way. So they radioed them. They took me about 4 miles, it's 4 or 5 miles up the road to Montebello, where the place, the campground there for the helicopter land. They met the helicopter, put me in the helicopter. I was flown to Charlottesville. Fortunately, the ride to Charlottesville was not long because it's not far from Charlottesville. Before I got into the emergency room, we don't know exactly how long it was. It was at least 4, it was probably 5 hours before I got to the emergency room. That is when Becky learned about something that happened. We'll turn this over to her now, and she will be telling you her part of the story and what she discovered today.
On Saturday, the day of Tony's fall, my daughter-in-law, who lived in Pittsburgh, texted both my daughter Sarah and I and said, "You guys are on my mind today. Is everything okay?" Of course, at the time, we thought everything was okay. It was only later when Sarah reminded me of that text that I realized God was already working to prompt others to begin holding us up in prayer. I received a call at about 6:30 on Saturday that Tony had been injured while hiking. He was being airlifted to UVA hospital and that he was in and out of consciousness. I called some close friends and briefly told them what I knew and asked if they could drive me to UVA. Just as we passed the first Waynesboro exit on 64, I received a call from the social worker at UVA asking if I knew my husband had been brought into the trauma unit. I said, yes, I knew, and we were on our way there. She said the surgeon wanted to talk to me and would be calling soon. Just as we crested the top of Afton Mountain, my phone rang again, and it was the surgeon. He didn't mince words at all. He said, Tony was bleeding significantly in his skull, and it was putting pressure on his brain. And if they didn't do surgery immediately, he would die. And then he went on to list all the bad things that could happen if they did surgery, and concluded by saying, but it's his best chance. That was the first I realized what kind of injuries Tony had. I expected broken arms and broken legs and thought he must have hit his head if he was in and out of consciousness, but really I had no clue that it was this bad. I didn't see Tony when I arrived at the hospital. He was being prepped for surgery. The surgery took about 2 hours, and the nurse called me when it was over and said the surgeon wanted to talk to me. We went up to the 3rd floor neuro ICU unit, and I saw that one of the elders from our church was there with her husband, who is a family physician. The nurse met me and said I could bring one other person in with me. I looked around the circle of people who were with me, and I said, I want the doctor to go in with me. So he went along in and was able to ask appropriate questions and interpret what the surgeon was saying. I was so grateful for his presence and knew that God had gone before me and arranged that. My mom found out about Tony's fall the next day on Sunday morning, and I talked to her by phone Sunday evening. She said to me, Becky, last night before I knew about any of this, I woke up in the middle of the night and just had a heavy feeling about your family. I didn't know what it was, but I prayed for all of you. Now I know what that was about. The Spirit prompted her and she listened. In those early days, my dear friend Joy Yoder sent me a text message every morning with a Bible verse and some encouraging words. Each morning when I was trying to gather up my courage to walk back into that hospital, it was so nice to know that someone was thinking of me right then and praying for me. That might seem like a small, insignificant thing, but to me, it was huge and just the encouragement I needed. On Tuesday of that first week, I came down from ICU and took a little break and encountered Elaine Clymer, a woman from my church, in the lobby. I knew she had been struggling with some significant health issues. She had just received a devastating diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, which had spread to her liver. And we embraced there in the lobby, shed some tears together, and tried to comfort each other. During the weeks that followed, I never got to see her again, but she posted words of encouragement several times on Tony's Caring Bridge website, even though she was undergoing her own health crisis. She passed away a couple weeks after Tony returned from the hospital, and I never got to thank her for her words of encouragement. Tony's brother Tim, who lives in South Georgia, called me during the first week of Tony's hospitalization. He wanted to come and see Tony, but wanted to come at a time that worked for me. I told him that the coming weekend there would be lots of people around, but that the following weekend would work well for me. I knew he didn't want to wait a whole week before coming, but he agreed to come the following weekend. He arrived on Thursday afternoon of Tony's second week at UVA. The next morning, Friday morning, we were informed that Tony would be moving to Washington, D.C. that very afternoon. Tim was right there at my side and able to drive me to DC and stay for the weekend to help get Tony settled in. There was no way I could have planned that because I didn't know in advance that it would happen. But I was provided for, and there was no need to make any phone calls and try to arrange someone to accompany me. God knew and had already arranged everything. The third week after the accident, which would have been the first week Tony was in DC, I had an email conversation with my sister-in-law and wrote these words. Someone asked me if I had anyone staying with me at night when I'm home, and really the thought hadn't even occurred to me. I feel so at peace when I'm home. That first night this week when I went to bed, I just had a picture of an angel with a flaming sword standing guard outside each of my doors. It was so real that the next morning I actually went to the door to see if there were tracks in the snow. I hold that image in my mind every evening when I go to bed and I feel peaceful and safe. I don't ever remember feeling fear on those nights when I stayed at home alone. I really do believe there were angels guarding me. I remember driving home from DC for the first time. It was Monday evening. I had spent the day with Tony in the hospital, meeting the therapists and discussing the care plan. I left the hospital about 7:30 p.m. for the drive home. It had snowed that weekend. I'm a bit intimidated by big city driving, so I was concerned about finding my way out of the city. My son David and I reviewed the route I'd take on Google Maps before I left. I remember the feeling of relief when I got to the sign that said 66 and passed the Vienna metro stop because I knew the way from there. Several times on that solitary drive home, I almost broke down and wept from the sheer enormity of the situation, from fatigue, from the uncertainty of the future. I kept saying, girlfriend, you're driving right now, just hold it together until you get home. And I did. I remember pulling into my driveway and just sobbing. I walked into the house. My friends were there with a fire in the wood stove, warm soup in a pot, and a shoulder to cry on, and loving hugs. I was exhausted, but I also felt very cared for. I didn't want Tony to be alone in DC, in a strange place, so it was arranged that someone would stay with him every day while he was there. Family members covered most of the first week. and church friends volunteered to come up the second week. There was always someone there with him during the day when I couldn't be there. We had more volunteers than we had days to fill. This was all organized by someone from our church who had volunteered to be the coordinator. I told him what my needs were for volunteers, and he made the calls to line things up. This was a huge blessing because it meant that in addition to all the other things I needed to do, I didn't need to make any of these phone calls. The arrangements were made for me. After they assessed Tony's situation, the rehab hospital told me that they expected Tony's stay to be 3 weeks. So I planned to take off work the entire third week so I could be at the hospital learning about his therapy so I could continue it at home. But in the middle of the second week, they called to say that Tony was doing so well, they were going to release him that weekend on Saturday. So I scrambled to change my plans. Ron Stolzfus, a friend of Tony's, had been planning to come up on Saturday for the day. So he and my daughter Sarah drove up in a van and brought Tony and I home. We arrived to a plowed driveway. It had snowed again. Warm food, balloons, and lots of hugs. We were weary, but so glad to be home and not have to drive back and forth to the city again. This began the long journey back from injury through lots and lots of rehab and therapy sessions to the recovery that we see today. About a month after Tony came home from the hospital, I had a day when everything just seemed to come crashing in on me, and I felt like I was losing it. I called my friend, Brenda Fairweather, and told her I was falling apart. She and her husband, Bobby, came over. Bobby stayed with Tony, and Brenda took me out to Sweet Frog, where we talked and laughed and ate frozen yogurt and just did something normal for a little while. She helped me get my feet back under me so I could go home and keep doing it. During Tony's recovery, I saw him work harder than anyone I've ever seen. He was determined to come back as far as possible. He doggedly did his exercises every single day, multiple times, I might add. Gradually, I encouraged him to begin doing other things to assist his recovery, things like building birdhouses in his shop, getting back on his bike and riding miles and miles around the church parking lot next door, and taking short hikes together after his therapy sessions at Augusta Medical Center. I felt like it was important for him to begin doing normal things in a familiar setting to bring back as much memory and skill as possible. We were blessed by the way our adult children stepped in and helped us during this time of crisis. Sarah was facing a serious health crisis of her own during this time, so she was carrying a double burden. She made quite a number of initial phone calls and contacts that first night while I was headed to the hospital, and I know those were difficult calls to make. Sarah and both of our sons, one from Pittsburgh and one from DC, came immediately the next day, stayed several days, and returned several times to support me and be with their dad. And once Tony was moved to DC, our son stopped by every evening after work for several hours and spent his entire days off with Tony. In an early conversation with my mom, when I was talking about returning to normal, she told me that things would probably always be different, but that didn't mean it would be bad. At the time, I didn't want to hear that. I wanted things to return to normal, whatever that was. But she was right. I know now that things will always be different, and that's not bad. We are forever changed by this experience. I feel like we had the privilege of having a front row seat to see God at work in countless ways. So we continue the journey back. Some days seem almost normal, but there are other times when we are clearly reminded that things are different. We value our time together and hope we still have many more years to share life together. But I know now that there is a strength available in times of crisis that goes beyond human understanding. Even on that first day, I felt like something came up underneath me and just held me up. I learned that God can absolutely be trusted, and that it really is true that He will never leave us or forsake us. I've learned that being part of God's community of believers means that others will come alongside us and help hold us up and bear the burden with us so that we don't need to journey alone. We received a huge outpouring of support: prayers, financial gifts, food, cards, firewood, words of encouragement, help with transportation to appointments, caregivers to come be with Tony so I could begin returning to work, and just lots of love and care. This is not an experience I would ever wish on anyone, and yet we are better people for having walked through it. And I've learned that God is a God of resurrection. He turns death into life. He is a mighty redeemer who can take a devastating event and turn it into something holy. Praise be to God.
We've heard Becky share a lot of things people did for us. The list is much larger. If we told you all the stories, we'd be here all afternoon. So I'm not gonna keep you here all afternoon. But there are two other ones that I would like to share that were special meaning for me. When she talked about caregivers coming so she could go back to work, more people volunteered. There was days, 4 days a week. My close friend, Bobby Fairweather, he took off work every Tuesday for 7 months. Every Tuesday for 7 months. He came early in the morning, got the paper out of the mailbox, stayed with me till Peggy got home from work after 5 o'clock. Quite often come back and had eaten with his wife later. I mean, support, unbelievable level of support. One other one I'd like to share with you, Ron Stoss Foods, who I've been hiking with regularly for about 3 years. We make many hikes. He'd been going every year to Arizona to hike the Grand Canyon. And that's a major hike. It takes a lot of planning. He'd make a reservation. He had to make 8 months ahead of time for a place to stay on the North Rim. He had to reserve 18 months ahead of time. 18 months ahead. He would make his reservation 18 months. He'd done it for 5 or 6 years. He reserved a cabin. It had 5 beds in it. And he'd take different people each year. He came on that first year when he was coming each day, week, just to be with me. He said, Tony, whatever you think you're capable of doing, I'm going to save one of those beds. I want you to go to the Grand Canyon. I want to take you to the Grand Canyon. And I want to save one of those beds for you. I'll set up 3 other people to go with me. There's one other bed. You don't have to tell me right away, whenever. Just let me know maybe a couple weeks before, because always other people want to go. And I wasn't even walking well then. And so, like, thanks, Ron. I really appreciate it. But a year and a half later, I said, Ron, let's do it. I want to go. And so I trained hard as I could that year. I told him to take, my mental processing was not working well. It still doesn't work normal. And I said, if you can get me there, because this is like, from the time we left home until I got back was almost a week, 6.5 days, I think. I said, I cannot make these reservations to the airport and all that. I said, just get me there. I'll get in shape. I'll take that hike. But you got to get me home then. And 3.5 years after my fall, we went out there and did it. We started 4 o'clock in the morning, and 14 hours later, we came up the other side. It's 21 miles, 13,000 feet of elevation change altogether. And, that was a humongous, just a huge experience for me for recovery, and having someone really step out of the way to help. My life has been very different, but it's been very good. I've learned that life is a precious, precious gift. And I've learned, beginning to learn to take one day at a time, just one day at a time. Thank you.